Welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. Today's video is going to focus on, I guess, one of my favorite consoles, or at least it seems to be a console that I seem to do services on the most. And it is for the Atari 7800. Specifically, it's going to be this little guy right here. This is an alternate BIOS designed for the Atari 7800 with some pretty nifty features. Let's talk about this. Here is the new BIOS chip. Now, I want to talk about this real quick. For starters, what you see is essentially I guess you could call it a pre-production version of this. Eventually these will be sold through the AtariAge store is the initial plan. So what you see labeled on this chip here is not necessarily how they will be labeled in the future. But I have a small pile of them here for right now, and these are the stickers I created. So what specifically is this about, and why do we even care? Well, very valid questions. So if you just want to skip to the beginning of the actual installation process for this, then I will have a timer or something along here. I will also have it in the video description on where to advance to, so you can skip the brief history that I'm going to go through here. But for the rest of you, let's talk about this. There are two primary 7800 BIOS chips or programs that were used. There was the one used in the North American NTSC consoles, and there was, of course, the one used in the European nation for PAL consoles. Now, the main difference between them is two things. Let's talk about the PAL version of the BIOS and how it works versus the NTSC one. So the PAL version, or the European BIOS, what it would do is basically you would turn on the system, it would go straight to the game, straight to the 7800 game or 2600 game that you had inserted, and you were good to go. But if you did not have a cartridge plugged into the 7800 on the European BIOS, then it would actually load up the game Asteroids Deluxe, which is actually pretty cool when you think about it, because number one, you've got a game that's already in the system essentially. It basically comes with a pre-installed game, which then takes us to the North American BIOS chip. Here's an example of one right here that I have removed previously. So the North American BIOS, for starters, it does not have an included game. So, you know, if you didn't have a game in the system when you turned it on, well, then you just got a black screen, or you just got scrambled bars, or anything other than a game, of course. The second is that when you do have a 7800 game inserted in the console and you power it on, you will see a pretty fancy, you know, little Atari rainbow logo that comes up in the center of the screen for a few seconds before the game starts. Now that logo is actually serving a purpose, and that's because the North American version of the BIOS and the North American versions of the games included additional coding in the game that essentially had them encrypted. So what was going on is there was a brief security check being done during that little rainbow loader screen on the North American consoles. It's verifying that the console you have, or that the game you have inserted, is an actual authentic Atari 7800 game. That's pretty much the only thing. The North American version just has this extra encryption check, no game included. The European versions of the BIOS did not have this security encryption check, but they did include the game Asteroids Deluxe. So kind of cool. Since that time, there have actually been kits you can get both from Best Electronics out of California and also from the Brewing Academy that basically have the European BIOS as a kit that you can install into an NTSC 7800. Now, aside from the fact that you would have the included game just like it is in the European version, the fact that it doesn't do the digital signature allows you to play PAL versions of the 7800 games on a North American console. So that takes us back to this BIOS here. So what basically happened is a very prolific programmer, tech guru, who's been around the AtariAge forums for a very long time under the name of RevEng. His actual name is Mike Saarna, and created two quick demos that were pretty cool. One was a screen demo that basically shows you an area of the screen and what portions of your graphics, if you program them in those areas, might potentially be cut off depending on the kind of screen being used. That screen being a display like the LCD or CRT. The second thing he made was a non-interactive, just a graphics demo that had basically the words Atari 7800 on it in the corner on one side, and it had a partial graphic of the Atari Fuji with the rainbow scrolling colors going up it. It was very cool, very modern, but very retro at the same time. And of course, one of our most prolific homebrew developers for the Atari 7800, Bob DeCrescenzo, also known as PacManPlus, but he came up with the idea, he's like, wouldn't it be cool if we could add that new graphic loader to the BIOS? Well, one thing led to another, and before you know it, he actually had that graphic loader from working with Mike. They got that graphic loader working on a customized BIOS instead of the normal rainbow scroller that we would normally see. But Bob decided to take it a step further. He said, you know what? Wouldn't it be cool if we also mimic the same functionality that's in the European BIOS? You know, mainly remove the digital signature check, but at the same time, maybe include a game. So Bob wanted to include one of his games. And he thought about it for a while, and ultimately he decided that what he would do instead is that he would create his own unique game just for this BIOS. And that's what happened. So he created a game called Kiloparsec. So yeah, that's what this BIOS is. This BIOS has no encryption check, but it still has the cool graphic loader. It does have the ability to skip that loader if you want to have the games load up a little bit quicker. And if you don't have a game inserted into the console, you will in fact get Kiloparsec loaded up instead for you to play on the system. The purpose of this video, besides talking about this wonderful new BIOS, is the process in installing a customized BIOS in a 7800. Specifically, I'm going to install this particular BIOS that has the new Kiloparsec ROM on it. But this would apply to basically any customized BIOS for the 7800, the European ones, including this one. So let's get to it. What tools might you need for this project? Well, our staple, number 2 Phillips. Always got to have that. It's just part of it. Just got to have it. You're also, of course, going to need the BIOS kit, which will include the 2 IC chips and at least one socket, and it might also include a length of some wire as well. You might very well need some needle nose pliers or something similar to it. Again, this is to help remove the RF shielding. You're probably going to need those flush cutters. You might need some tweezers, some electrical tweezers. Always make sure you got some flux on hand. Make sure you got some Q-tips and maybe a toothbrush to help clean up your work. And obviously you're going to want a good adjustable soldering iron. And because we're going to have to desolder an IC chip as part of this process, you're probably going to also need some good desoldering braid, or wick as it's sometimes called, or better yet, something really heavy duty like a desoldering iron. Or you could get by with just using the old hand desoldering pumps, although that would take a lot more work and will require more care. And that's really pretty much all we're going to really need for this. There's really not a whole lot of tools we need. The project itself is fairly simple with the exception of the desoldering. So let's get to it. Let's disassemble that 7800. To take apart a 7800 is actually pretty easy. It's got 5 screws normally that are used to hold everything together. I say normally because I've seen some that don't have them all in place. So where are those screws located? Well, you've got 2 in the back, located up here. Not sure if my camera's going to catch that. There we go. And then we have 3 more along the front. Okay. Once you've got all those screws separated, then the top cover will just lift right off. And that leaves you with the main board assembly itself. Now the cool part about this is the whole main board, if you basically lift it up from the back and then kind of grab it, you can lift it right out of the case, which makes it far easier to work on at this point. Now, we do have to get to the components underneath the RF shielding. So for that, you're going to need to get a set of maybe some small needle nose pliers. I've actually got this, it's actually, I think it's a twisting tool for wire as well as like a prong for lifting up IC chips. Now, what you need to do is, there are little tabs located along the side of the RF shielding that are normally twisted. So what you would need to do is get the tool, or your needle nose, and just twist them counterclock until they're completely flush and straight with the little slats that they line up with. Now, in addition to the tabs that are all along the RF shielding here, there's also two more located in the back that are hiding between the heatsink of the RF, or the heatsink of the voltage regulator and that RF shield as well. So don't forget to remove that one too. After that, if everything's in place and you got all the little tabs straightened out, then just carefully start on one side and start lifting up on the shield using something thin and small to get under it to kind of pry, like I am here. There we go. Remove that out of the way. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of the bottom RF shield as well, because it's possible you may have to, well, it's not possible, you will likely have to access the bottom as well. So let's get that off. And here is the standard 7800 mainboard. The other thing you will notice about this particular 7800 is that everything on here is soldered directly to the board. There is nothing in a socket. And unfortunately, this is pretty common on most 7800s. Now the chip, the two places that we need to focus on for this install are going to be right here. This is the original BIOS chip located here. And also right over here next to the another buffer used for the video output section. Right here is a 74LS08. But we're going to be piggybacking off of this for using our new 74LS04. Basically, we're going to install the 74LS04 on top of it, soldering on 3 of the pins, using it to provide the necessary inverting for the signals for a new EEPROM. Now, again, this BIOS chip is only 24 pins, whereas the replacement, which I will go ahead and take out of the styrofoam right here, is 28 pins. So it's a larger chip. Now, as it turns out, there's actually silk screening on the board to accommodate a larger chip. But every 7800 I have seen actually has the silk screen and empty vias in place for a 28 pin chip to be used instead of the common 24. But it is soldered in place. So that means it has to be removed as part of this process. The first thing we want to do here is the hardest part, and that's going to be to get this chip desoldered out of place, the original BIOS chip. So let's go ahead and get that removed. Now, I have safely removed the old BIOS chip out of the mainboard, as you saw. One of the other things that's required as part of this installation, and I had mentioned this before, was that you would need a section of wire. Now, what you have to do is, that's because we basically have to feed a section of wire that's going to end up coming off of the 74LS04 that we end up attaching here. We're going to need to attach a wire from it to pin 22 on the new BIOS chip right here. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You could obviously just attach it or just solder the wire to the pin on the bottom, and then what you can do is route the wire up through one of these openings here from where one of the color adjustment pots is, and then from there route it up to the chip. I've done that before. But because I'm going to be using this thin piece of Kynar wire here, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to attach it to pin 22 where I need to here, and then route it underneath like this, so that when I go to install my socket, it'll basically sit underneath the socket like that, so I won't have to run any wiring underneath. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I'm going to do it in this particular install. So before I put this socket in place, there's one other thing we need to do as well as part of this install, and that is that there is a 0 ohm resistor, or even possibly a jumper, right here next to this bottom video RAM chip that's next to a spot marked W1. Turns out this 0 ohm jumper is actually in spot W2, and we need to desolder it and move it over to W1 instead. Just have to desolder that one leg and move it over one spot. And that's because the bottom legs here, these are actually tied together with a trace. So even if you were to move it completely over to this via and this via, it would still attach to this point here just the same. So it's just as easy to just desolder the one end, lift it up, move it over, stick it into the other spot. I'm going to go ahead and get my wires stripped and get that ready for pin 22. So we're going to start from down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. It's actually the one that's right next to the silk screen that says DBM. It's this one right here. And then to kind of keep the wiring a little bit neat and tidy, I will go ahead and probably pass it under these resistors here, like that, just to set it out of the way. Then I can go ahead and get my socket, my replacement socket, and set that in where it needs to go. I now have the new socket in place, ready for the new BIOS chip. I've got my jumper set where I need to, from W2 over to W1, and I have my wire that I've got in place that needs to connect to pin 22 on the new chip, and will eventually connect over here to the new74LS04 that will piggyback on top of the current 74LS08. We actually only need 4 pins that we're going to use from this chip. All the others will not be needed. Now, most procedures that go through this process will actually tell you to go ahead and, either bend up or cut the legs that we're not going to use. And you can certainly do that. That's not a problem. Just keep in mind that whenever you bend them up like that, or if you cut them especially, that you are weakening the chip and potentially not, rendering it useless for any other function. That's another reason why I suggested you might want to have a small 14-pin socket for it. Because what you could do instead is you could sacrifice the socket by clipping the pins we don't need to use from the socket and not remove any of the pins from the actual 7404. This way the 7404 can be popped out and used in something else or what have you. So that's what I'm going to do on this. It will make the entire assembly stand a little taller than it needs to, but that's okay. I'm not really that concerned about it. And I think it'll be far easier if I just go about that route. Just cut the legs I don't need, in this case, off of the socket chip and not off the actual 7404. I'll leave that alone. And I'm going to go ahead and install the 7404 into the new socket that I have here. Just like that. So which pins do we need to get rid of? Well, what we need to do is we basically need to clip off or remove pins 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the pin 1 side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. 3, 4, 5, and 6. And again, I'm doing this because in my opinion it's much easier to sacrifice the socket versus the actual IC chip. On the 8 through 14 side, we basically need to clip off pins 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So only pin 14 will remain. So I'm going to go ahead and clip all of those. And that leaves us with a socket that doesn't have much on it except for just 4 pins on it. Now, pin 2, we actually need to bend that pin upward. That's because we're going to end up soldering a wire to that pin. That wire is going to be the other end of the wire that we soldered off of pin 22 on the actual EEPROM. So I've got that pin kind of soldered or bent up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply some solder to these pins. Now I did that to make it easier for the next part, which is going to be to solder this socket on top of the 7408 that's currently on the main board. We now have our double-decker IC chips in place. So the next thing I need to do is to get the other end of the wire that I ran through, and I need to solder it onto pin 2 of my 7404 through the socket there. There we are. I have that wire soldered in place, just like that. Now we can go ahead and get our new BIOS chip and we can pop it into the socket. Making sure, of course, that the notch on the chip, and hopefully you installed the notch as well in the socket, matching up with the silk screen and also matching up with the notches on the video RAM just above it. There we are. But there's one more step left. So the very last step that we need to do at this point before we're ready to try to test this bad boy out is there is a trace that needs to be disconnected from the bottom of the main board. Specifically, it's the trace that goes from pin 1 on the original 7408, which is located here, and connects to where pin 22 is on the new BIOS chip. And there's a very easy spot to cut that. The trace in question is located right here. And I'll be sure to zoom the camera, I'll be sure to zoom in on this a little bit. It's this trace located right along like here. We've got plenty of open space in here. So, how do you get rid of that? Well, there's a couple of ways to do it, and I'm probably just going to use the X-Acto blade method here. So, I'm going to go ahead and carefully cut this trace by just kind of scoring a line across it a couple of times. Okay. Pretty sure I'm cut through there. And the easiest way to check, of course, is to use a multimeter and check to see if there's any continuity between pin 22 and pin 1, because there shouldn't be. Nothing at all. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if that was the wrong trace? Well, I'll show you what happens. If I go up a little bit closer to where I cut it, see that? So I'm able to complete the bridge and complete that trace using the probe on my multimeter to be able to verify. So at that point, we're basically ready to reassemble this back into the case and check it out. So let's do that. I now have the 7800 at least partially back in the bottom shell just for protection purposes, because of course it would not be such a cool thing to completely reassemble it and then find out you have a problem, right? So I've got it initially put back into the shell. I have it connected back through RF up to my little flat panel TV back here. Ignore the gray line that you see going across it. That's just a bad segment in the panel, and that's why it's on my bench. And also excuse my messy bench, please. Anyway, let's see what we get. We got the new Atari 7800 bootloader, and there's the game, Kiloparsec. Oh. By the way, if you hold down the pause button while turning on the console, it will bypass the bootloader entirely and take you straight into the built-in game. Now, let's put in an actual cartridge and see how it behaves. Now, what should happen is when I power it on, it should basically load up the little bootloader. And it takes us to our game. Now, you don't see the bootloader for very long on this because this TV actually kind of has trouble with the RF, so it takes a little while for it to lock on each time, but you get the idea. And again, if you just want to go straight to the game itself, hold down the pause button while you turn on the console, and that'll take you straight into the start of your game. Hey, it's Mike. I do not miss RF. So that pretty much wraps it up. We're good to go. Thanks again for hanging out with me this afternoon here at the Ivory Tower. As a reminder, these kits aren't for sale just yet, but hopefully they will be soon through AtariAge, and hopefully whenever those kits are available and you've purchased one for yourself, you find this video helpful in helping you to better understand how it works and how to install it in your Atari 7800. So until next time, I'll catch you guys later.